All right, so are you ready to like really get into something interesting today?
Always.
Okay, good. Because, well, this is a deep dive, and we're tackling a paper, an academic paper, that makes a pretty surprising argument.
Oh,
It analyzes the Trump-Musk partnership,
okay.
but, and here's the twist, it presents their collaboration as, get this, a potential model for American progress.
Wow. That's
Yeah,
certainly not what you typically hear.
not at all. So let's unpack it. Let's see what we can learn.
Okay. So what makes this paper stand out, I think, is it kind of goes beyond like the usual political stuff, you
Right.
know? It digs into how this unusual pairing, I mean, come on, Trump and Musk,
Right.
how that could actually offer some valuable insights for how things like, innovation, governance, these public-private partnerships could work.
In the 21st century.
Yeah.
So the paper, it doesn't just say this is a good model.
Mm-hmm.
It's saying this partnership, it was successful
Yeah.
and points to some like real tangible benefits.
Yeah.
What are they? What are those benefits?
So they highlight advancements in renewable energy, stuff like solar expansion, battery storage tech, wind energy, all areas where, the partnership is credited with making big strides.
Okay, so it's not all just talk. It's like actual progress.
Right.
That's interesting. But what kind of impact like are we even talking about? Did these advancements really make a difference?
Well, the paper gives some numbers, and they're impressive, like a 50% growth to solar energy capacity,
Yeah.
a 30% reduction in emissions through sustainable construction, and wind energy now supplying 20% of U.S. electricity needs. I mean, think about that. What if your electricity bill was cut in half thanks to solar?
Right.
You know?
Those are big numbers.
Yeah.
And they actually like translate to real world stuff for people like
Yeah.
cheaper energy, cleaner air.
Right.
It's starting to become clear why the paper sees this as a potential model. But how does a partnership like this, I mean, with all its like unconventional stuff, how does it even fit into like democratic values?
Yeah.
That's got to be a question on a lot of people's minds.
Definitely, yeah. That's like a central question. And the paper faces it head on. It argues that the Trump-Musk model, it actually put accountability frameworks in place, things like advisory councils, public reporting, performance metrics. It's all about finding a balance, promoting innovation, but keeping things transparent, oversight, all that.
So it wasn't just like a free-for-all.
Yeah.
There were structures to keep them accountable.
Right.
That's an interesting way to look at it. Could you give some specific examples of those frameworks like in action?
Sure. The paper mentions things like the American Technology Council. That was a platform for getting advice from experts. There were public announcements about, SpaceX and NASA working together,
Uh-huh.
and clear performance metrics for stuff like satellite launches.
It sounds like they were trying to be open about what they were doing, how they were doing it,
Yeah.
which is really important considering how much skepticism there is around, partnerships like this. But let's get to the heart of it. Could this model actually like be a blueprint for how we govern in the future?
That's the big question the paper's asking.
Yeah.
To answer that, it makes these really cool comparisons with historical examples, like think Edison, Ford, the railroad boom,
All right.
times when those kinds of public-private things really drove progress.
It's interesting to think about this partnership alongside those other times in history.
Hmm.
Are there any like specific takeaways we can get by looking at it that way?
Yeah, I think the paper highlights agile governance. It says this Trump-Musk partnership had this built-in agility, this ability to adapt and react fast to changing situations, something that traditional government often struggles with.
That makes sense, right? When you've got two forces like that known for being fast and innovative, you'd expect agility.
Yeah.
But does that automatically mean good governance?
Well, that's where things get tricky. The paper acknowledges there are criticisms, concerns, especially about Elon Musk's influence. But it argues that the partnership structure, at least in theory, had these safeguards for accountability.
So they're saying that even though Musk had all this influence, there were things in place to keep it in check.
Yeah, that's the argument.
That's a really nuanced take.
Yeah.
And it will probably spark some debate for sure. What are your thoughts on that? Did these safeguards actually work?
To really get into that, the paper compares the Trump-Musk model to other big collaborations from history, like the Manhattan Project, even NASA's Commercial Crew Program.
That's such a cool comparison. The Manhattan Project, that was huge, right? Such big implications. And it definitely involved figuring out this complicated dance between science, government, and ethics. Makes you wonder if there are parallels to be drawn with the concerns about Musk's influence in this case.
Exactly. And that's the point the paper is driving at. By comparing Trump-Musk to these historical examples, it wants to show us how our understanding of public-private partnerships has changed, gotten more complex.
Sounds like the paper is telling us to think beyond just good or bad and see how this fits into a bigger historical picture.
That's right. It's recognizing that these collaborations are rarely simple. They often involve balancing competing interests, different priorities.
This is a great transition to something else I found interesting. The paper argues that this partnership benefited from, that agile governance we talked about, that ability to adapt fast.
Hmm.
But wouldn't that also make it riskier, like for potential missteps or too much power in the wrong hands?
That's a really important point to think about. While that agility can be great for driving innovation, it also needs really strong safeguards and oversight. You need to prevent those very risks you're talking about.
So it's this constant balancing act. Like, how do you weigh the need for speed and flexibility with the need for accountability and transparency?
It's a challenge, no doubt, and there isn't one easy answer. But maybe we can learn from the partnership itself.
What do you mean?
Well, the paper argues that part of the reason this partnership worked was because the roles and responsibilities were so clearly defined.
Okay.
They both brought their strengths, the government with its resources and regulatory power, and Musk with his vision and that whole entrepreneurial drive.
So, like, a clear division of labor was key.
That seems to be a big takeaway, yeah. It's about using the strengths of each partner, but making sure nobody oversteps their bounds.
But wouldn't that require a ton of trust and collaboration?
Yeah.
Especially with the personalities involved in this partnership.
Oh, absolutely. Trust and communication, they're vital in any partnership, but maybe even more so in one as unconventional as this.
It's fascinating to think about the dynamics between them, how it all worked on a personal level. Does the paper get into that at all?
It touches on the need for clear communication, shared goals, that kind of thing, but it doesn't dive deep into the personal relationships, which makes sense considering what the paper's focusing on.
Yeah, that makes sense. So the paper sees the risks, but ultimately it's saying the benefits are greater.
In essence, yeah. It suggests that this model, if it's got the right safeguards and structure, can be a powerful engine for progress.
As we wrap up this deep dive into this really interesting paper, I'm struck by the questions it brings up about, the future of how we govern. We're in uncharted territory, and it feels like the old rules just don't apply anymore.
It really does feel like a time of huge change, rapid innovation, and partnerships like the one we've been discussing, they might become a lot more common. The big question is, how do we use their potential while also managing the risks?
And that's a question that needs careful thought, open discussion, and a willingness to adapt. This paper has given us so much to think about. But I'm left with one nagging question.
Okay.
If this Trump-Musk thing is really a potential model for the future, what safeguards would we absolutely need to have?
Yeah.
How do we make sure these kinds of collaborations stay accountable, stay transparent, and actually benefit everyone?
Those are fantastic questions. And they lead us to something crucial that the paper doesn't directly address: ethical considerations. How do we make sure that these partnerships, driven by innovation and ambition, don't lose sight of ethical boundaries, of what's best for society as a whole?
It's like we're on the edge of a whole new era, and we need to be ready to deal with the ethical challenges that come with it.
It really makes you think, right? How risk, innovation, even leadership, how those things have changed in these partnerships. This Trump-Musk model, it feels different from how things were done before.
Yeah, like we're in uncharted waters with these new types of partnerships.
Yeah.
And like you said before, one of the biggest worries about this one is Elon Musk's influence. How does the paper address that?
It tackles it head on. It knows that Musk, with his strong personality, all his power in the private sector, it raises questions. Legitimate questions about whether he could have too much sway over policy decisions.
So how does the paper square that with saying this partnership is a good model?
It comes back to those structured advisory roles, the accountability frameworks we talked about. The argument is that those were designed to channel Musk's expertise in a way that kept things democratic, kept things accountable. Basically, they were meant to stop his influence from going unchecked.
So they're saying that even though Musk was at the table, he wasn't the one calling all the shots. His role was more about giving input, expertise, not dictating what happens. But is that really how it worked?
That's a good question, and it's one that deserves more attention. To back up its argument, the paper compares the Trump-Musk model to other high-profile collaborations between the government and individuals or companies, like the Manhattan Project, for example, where scientists had a huge hand in developing the atomic bomb.
That's a perfect example. The Manhattan Project was a turning point in history, And it definitely raised questions, ethical questions, about the role of scientists in government decisions. It makes you think, are there parallels with the concerns about Musk's influence here?
Exactly. And that's the point the paper's trying to get across. By comparing Trump-Musk to these historical examples, it wants to show that our understanding of public-private partnerships has evolved. It's more complex now.
It's like the paper wants us to move beyond simple labels, good or bad, and look at how this partnership fits into the bigger picture of history.
Exactly. It's recognizing that these collaborations are rarely black and white. There's often this delicate balance between different interests, different priorities.
This ties into something else I found really interesting. The paper says the Trump-Musk partnership benefited from, remember that agile governance we talked about, the ability to adapt and respond quickly. But wouldn't that also make it riskier? More potential for missteps or unchecked power.
You're hitting on a very important point. While agility can be a huge plus for driving innovation and progress, it needs strong safeguards, oversight mechanisms to prevent those very risks.
It's like a constant balancing act, isn't it? How do you balance the need for speed and flexibility with the need for accountability and transparency?
It's tough, for sure, and there's no one easy answer. But maybe we can learn something from the partnership itself.
Like what?
The paper suggests that the partnership's success, at least in part, came from clearly defined roles and responsibilities. They each brought their strengths. The government with resources and regulatory power, Musk with his vision and entrepreneurial drive.
So having a clear division of labor was key.
That seems to be one of the main takeaways, yeah. It's about harnessing the strengths of each partner, but making sure neither side oversteps.
But wouldn't that take a huge amount of trust
Yeah.
and collaboration? Especially considering the personalities involved in this specific partnership.
Absolutely. Trust and communication are essential for any partnership to work, but even more so in one as unique as this.
It's mind-blowing to think about the dynamics between them, how it all worked on a personal level. Did the paper go into that at all?
It mentions the importance of clear communication, having shared goals, that kind of thing, but it doesn't delve into the specifics of their personal relationships.
Right.
Which is understandable, given the scope of the paper.
That makes sense. So ultimately, the paper sees the risks but says the benefits are worth it.
Essentially, yes. It suggests that this model, if it has the right safeguards and structure, can really drive progress.
As we keep digging into this fascinating paper, I'm really struck by what it makes us think about in terms of how we govern in the future. Like, we're in uncharted territory, and the old rules don't seem to apply anymore.
It truly feels like a time of rapid change and big innovations. And partnerships like the one we're talking about, they might become more and more common. The big question is, how do we tap into their potential without being blind to the risks?
And that's a question that demands careful thought, open and honest conversations, and willingness to adapt. This paper has given us so much to consider. But I have one question that keeps coming back to me.
What's that?
If this Trump-Musk partnership really is a possible model for the future, what safeguards would we absolutely need to have? How do we ensure these collaborations are accountable, transparent, and actually serve the best interests of everyone?
Those are excellent questions, and they point to something really important that the paper doesn't explicitly address: ethical considerations. How can we ensure that these powerful partnerships, driven by innovation and ambition, don't lose sight of ethical boundaries and what's truly best for society as a whole?
It's like we're standing in the edge of a whole new era, and we need to be ready to face the ethical complexities that come with it. It's like we're building this bridge, right, to the future of how we govern, but we better make sure it's got strong railings, some safety nets built in.
I like that. A good analogy. Innovation, progress, they're important, but we can't just rush ahead without thinking about the what-ifs, what could go wrong, and putting safeguards in place.
Exactly. And those safety features, in this case, they're all about making sure things are transparent, that people are held accountable, and that these partnerships, they're really benefiting everybody, not just a select few.
Yeah, we can't just assume that every time a partnership like this happens, it's automatically a win-win. We have to ask the hard questions, like who's really benefiting, who has the power to make the decisions, and maybe most importantly, who's being left out.
It's about making sure that progress isn't coming at a cost for certain people or communities. We have to be aware of the potential for unintended consequences and, actually work to prevent them.
Absolutely. And that takes ongoing scrutiny, open discussions, and a willingness to change course if things aren't working.
It's like navigating in uncharted waters. Right? You got to be constantly watching for hazards and adjusting your course as you go. But how do we, like as individuals, how do we even stay informed about these complex issues? How do we stay involved?
Well, that's where things like this deep dive come in. It's all about making information accessible, getting people to think critically, and encouraging them to ask questions, to challenge assumptions.
There's that saying, right? Knowledge is power. And in a world where these types of partnerships are becoming more and more common, we need to empower ourselves. We need to be informed and be part of the conversation.
Exactly. It's not just about the experts, the policymakers. It's about all of us being engaged citizens involved in shaping the future of how we're governed.
This whole deep dive has really been eye-opening for me. I'm seeing the complexities, the potential downsides of these partnerships in a new light. It's clear there's no easy fix, no single answer that works for everything.
You're spot on. It's all about striking that balance. And that balance, it's probably going to look different depending on the specifics of each partnership. The key is to approach them with a critical eye. Always be asking, is this really for the greater good?
And are we, as a society, are we doing enough to ensure these partnerships are truly accountable and transparent?
Those are the questions we should all be asking ourselves, because in the end, the future of how we govern, it's not just about finding the perfect model. It's about building a system that can adapt, that responds to what's happening, and that's accountable to the people it's supposed to serve.
It's a conversation that needs to keep going. It's a process that keeps evolving.
Yeah.
And we, the deep divers, we're all part of that process.
So let's keep those minds curious, keep those conversations going, and never stop thinking critically.
And remember, the future of governance, it's not something that just happens to us. It's something we create together. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, and until next time, keep exploring.